I have a bit of a confession to make before I get into the meaning of this text. It's not something I'm proud of, but maybe you'll understand me a little bit better after I tell you this story. When I was in high school, I had but really one rebellion. And to some degree, even though it's confession, I'm kind of proud of this. I grew up in a very religious household. You've heard about my father, and some of you have met my mother, and they were very devout, and my father was very dedicated, and I worshiped my father pretty much. I mean, reveled and wanted to be exactly like him, and was very proud of who he was. And as a direct result, my rebellion in youth was actually very little. I did not get wrapped up in a lot of the temptations that you would find in the teenage years, which is a blessing, which is a great reality. That many of the pitfalls of the teenage years and of high school never really came my way. As a matter of fact, I had a reputation in our town of being almost too good. I was the guy in high school whose parents in town, everybody wanted me to date their daughter. Unfortunately, none of the daughters did, but that's beside the point. Nevertheless, I had a very clean reputation, and to be honest, and this isn't bragging or anything, I really had no desire to get wrapped up in a lot of those things. I was the kid who carried a Bible to high school, and I was the kid who led the prayer at every basketball game, and I was the kid that they designated as the religious kid, and I was kind of a fanatic in that. But I did have, and this is the confession part, I did have one great rebellion, and that was I drove like a maniac. I don't know why, I don't know what caused me to do this, but that in a sense, I knew my parents didn't like it. And as all teenagers do, you have to have something that causes you to rebel against your parents, and that was my rebellion. And so I was ultimately a speed demon. And I don't rejoice in this now because I am a parent now, and I'm really glad the family's not here today to hear any of this, etc. Of course, they will come when my children have to drive, and I will give them the lecture, and I will tell them the dangers. And now being an adult, I know how ridiculous this was, but what is even worse is I grew up in the hills of Arkansas. It is incredibly dangerous. The curves and no guardrails at the time. I mean, it was completely atrocious what I was able to accomplish. But here was the thing: is that I got in as a direct result of my rebellion. I was stopped multiple times for speeding. As a matter of fact, one of my claims to fame is I was stopped 22 times my senior year of high school. 22 times, and here's the other claim to fame, I never got a ticket. Got out of every single one of them. Now, I don't say that as being braggadocious, I'm just laying the context and format for you. But the reality is when I became a freshman in college and started traveling between Milliken and Arkansas, I got stopped a bit more, and once I started getting tickets, they started to fall frequently. And one of the processes of when you get stopped ultimately is as soon as a policeman comes up, and I don't know who put this on the internet for them to show everybody, but we just pulled up an idea. One of the processes when you get stopped by a trooper, now put this in context as well. I wrote a paper my first year of college. I wrote a paper called How to Get Out of a Ticket. And one of the things that they will do is they automatically will ask you, do you have your ID? And of course, one of the best things to do is not to frantic and not to panic and have your ID ready. Make sure that you have it with you, and here you go, and present it in complete calm. Now, I got used to that. I didn't even intimidate me. The state trooper or somebody would come up and say, here's your ID, and I frequently did that. But something changed at the end of my freshman year of college. Specifically, my picture, not the picture on the ID, but me. I transformed over my freshman year of college. Now, this was a major transformation. In high school, I was very clean cut and very straightforward. I, every 2 weeks, had an appointment with the barber and got a flat top. I had a buzz haircut in high school. I looked like a Marine recruit, and I was an athlete. And so, I was very straightforward, kind of straight-laced, and my picture, young baby face, kind of my original picture when I was 16, flat, crew cut, blonde, no facial hair, baby face, young kid, etc. And that was my ID all the way up until I was 21 and eventually got changed. But that was who I was. But my freshman year of college, that picture changed. Radically changed. They warn you in college, or at least they did when I was there, about the freshman 15. freshman 15 is that they tell every freshman that you're probably going to gain 15 pounds your first year of college, your freshman year. Magnify that a bit for me. I mean, I was an athlete in high school. I stopped exercising, came to school. It's where I gained all my weight. Still not proud of that, but it was a major transformation. And then on top of that, I grew my hair out. And lo and behold, I'm not blonde anymore when I grew my hair out. And then on top of that, I grew a beard. And my beard was flaming red. Now, one day, traveling back from Arkansas, I got pulled over on the interstate in Missouri. And I got pulled over, and the first thing he does, state trooper comes up and he says, "Do you have your ID?" I showed him my ID. And there I was. I had a baseball cap on, so you couldn't even see my kind of original hair color on the top of my head. All I had was a red beard. I had gained a lot of weight. I was a different-looking individual, and the state trooper looked at the ID, looked at the picture, looked at me, looked at the picture, looked at me, and said, "This isn't you." I said, "Yeah, it is. That's me. Trust me." I'm trying to hold it up here. So, can you see the likenesses? Can you see the similarities? He goes, "Well, this is awfully suspicious. This might be your brother or something. You look similar, but this really isn't you. I mean, you have red hair. This doesn't have red hair on it. This has blonde hair on it." I mean, and this is, they looked at the weight thing and said, "This is laughable," kind of situation. And it was actually a she. She said, "No, I don't trust this." And she took me out of the car. And I never had this happen before, escorted me back to the police car and put me in the back seat while she continued to investigate this particular ID. Now, you talk about freaking out. At this point in time, I was scared to death, all because my ID didn't match up in her mind with what I was supposed to look like. It didn't seem to match for her. Now, I finally got out of it by pointing out to her very gently and very calmly saying, now this was a year after, I'm a freshman in college, so almost middle of my second semester. And I pointed out to her, I said, now if I was going to have a fake ID, don't you think I'd at least make myself 21? In the fake ID. And she kind of looked at the logic of that and said, "Yeah, you're probably right." And she called it in, and all the numbers seemed to match up, and everything seemed to work. And so I just simply got my ticket, and she let me go. But the whole point of that is that what are you known by? In this particular case, the only thing that a policeman has to go by when they stop you is your identification and the record that goes along with that identification. In today's world, they call you up on the computer, and they know you. Your identity is in that little card and what is on the computer. That's who you are to them. They don't know anything else about you. I mean, unless you're from a local town and that's where you get stopped, the policemen don't know who you are. They only know by your official state identification who you are and what's on the computer. And in some ways, that's really scary, because if they make a mistake on the computer, which has happened, and I've seen it happen before, if something doesn't get filed in the right way, if you have ever had court supervision and that doesn't get recorded correctly, they could have a warrant out for your arrest, because your identification relies upon that one little state authority official document. And if you travel across countries, you have a passport. And when you go through, that's a big deal. I mean, it used to be they stamped it and they checked it. And in today's world, they're always constantly checking to see if people are going across illegally or what they're bringing in. And they ask you all these questions. It can be very intimidating. And for the officials who are checking your identification, the people who are ultimately responsible for whether they let you in or not, the only way they know you is through that little piece of paper with your picture on it and what goes on into the computer as a direct result of your identification. And if something doesn't match up, not only is it a hassle, it can be very dangerous. And my point is this, is that how are you known? What is your identity? What is your identification? In this particular case, according to our state, this is all we have to identify us sometimes. This is our entire identity. But the truth is that all individuals are so much more than their ID. They're so much more than their driver's license, so much more than their passports. That is a truth that we know to be a reality. Individuals and their identification are made up more than just a piece of paper. And in many cases, they're made up more than just a name. I mean, think about how we identify people and associate people with names. Names mean things, especially in the Hebrew culture. In this particular passage that I just read, the name that you carried, the name of your household, gave you an identity. It was incredibly important. The house of David is what we're talking about here in this particular case. And David praised to God. He said, "Establish my house, the name of my house forever, so that you will be glorified." In other words, David wanted his identity to be wrapped up in the name of the eternal God. He wanted the identity of the household to be associated with the glory of God. Not the glory of man, not the glory of conquering the world, not the glory of what David had accomplished, but David wanted his household name to be associated with the glory of God. In other words, the identity of the house was more about what God was doing than what he was doing. Now, if you put that into perspective, that is incredibly profound. That is incredibly rich because David has accomplished a lot. If there was any household that had a major identity, it was going to be David's. Look at what David had accomplished. And it was read in the passages that we've read this morning. David has conquered Goliath. He came out as a shepherd. he defeats Goliath. He fights a civil war and wins. He eventually vanquishes Saul and his evilness in the empire. And then on top of that, he rids Israel of its enemies. The Philistines are defeated. He has gotten a reputation for being a spiritual and a holy person, and he has enriched the nation beyond belief. He is up there now in the realms of Moses and ultimately all of the great heroes of the faith. David is the supreme hero of the Israelite nation here. He's accomplished a lot. And he wants his identity not to be wrapped up in any of those things. He wants his identity to be wrapped up in the glory of God. That is incredible. Who among us can stand there and say that that's what we want for our victory? We all want to be known in this world. We want somebody to know who we are. I mean, think about the memorials that we put up in our society. I mean, we just recently in Decatur put up the World War II Memorial. And there's a reason that we call that generation the greatest generation. That's the identification we have given to an entire generation of people. And that's a great identification. Because look, and this is the reason we call them the greatest generation, think about what they accomplished. Historians look back and they say, look at this, you had the Great Depression. I mean, you had one of the most severe economic crises in all of history, and you survived that, and not only did you survive that, at the end of the Great Depression, you fought a world war on two major fronts, on two different parts of the world, fighting two different types of governments with massive amounts of resources. You overcame all of that and established the principles of democracy and justice throughout the world. You look at that in the historical context, you say, man, what an incredible generation. Look at what they went through. Look what they accomplished. That's their identity. But the truth is that each and every person in that generation is an individual. And those individuals have identities and they have names. What are those individuals known for? How do their families know who they are? How are they as individuals and individual people? How are their personalities? How are they known to the world? And if you break it down, you're going to have different answers for different people. But the point is that the identity of each of these individuals is unique. And in this particular case, David is saying, I want my family and I want me as an individual to be associated not with what I have accomplished, but when I am become an individual, I want people to see God first and foremost. And that is an enormous, unselfish act that is very hard to accomplish. Your identity. Do you have an identity? And what is your identity? How do people know who you are? And when they look at you, and this is the ultimate question here, do they see you and what you've accomplished, or do they see what God has accomplished in your life? And the amazing thing about that is that we have people who have accomplished great things here in this world, but not everybody has. But if you're looking at what God has accomplished, you can look at some of the greatest outcasts and find truth. In other words, there are people in this world who are great, who are honest, who are trustworthy. And by the world standards, they're not necessarily the greatest people that we would identify as success stories. In other words, there are people that are poor. There are people that are impoverished. There are people that have suffered in this world, and they have not necessarily even been successful by the standards of this world. But when you get to know them, when you look at them, and when you see them, you know that they are a person of God. And in that case, if that's their identity, think about how eternal that is over the standards of this world. In this world, we trumpet the success stories, and in some cases, rightfully so, they're great stories. But even more so, when we look at people, we don't have to identify them by the success of this world. We can identify them by the success of God in their lives. A great example is a few years ago in a particular church that is a very small church. Middle of nowhere kind of church. and I wasn't the pastor of that church, but I was visiting for some reason, and the local pastor was kind of leading me around and was talking about the ministries that were going on, and we were kind of comparing notes and going back and forth, and I stepped in, and there was an individual in there mopping the floor. And you could just tell that this was an act of service, that this was just the person seemed very comfortable, greeted me when I walked in the door, seemed to be just right. You can just tell sometimes when somebody seems to be in their element, right? And you walk in the door and this person is mopping the floor and it seemed as natural as anything. And the pastor turned around and said, hey, I don't remember the name. He says, hey, why don't you tell Tim here what you do for the church? And I'm expecting this person to say, I mop the floors. I open the door. I clean the sidewalks. I do the small little duties and tasks. That's what I'm expecting. My identification was the person's mopping the floor. I see them, and to me, it's a servant. So I'm expecting them to give some kind of answer like that, and the person turns around, takes the mop out of the bucket, starts mopping the floor and goes, I lead people to Jesus, and continues to mop. And then takes the mop and puts it back in the bucket. And that was one of the most incredible pieces of identification and identity and understanding of who they were in the kingdom of God it was a great lesson for me. In other words, they weren't up there standing preaching sermons. They weren't serving communion necessarily. They weren't doing some of the things that you would think you would do when you say you're leading people to Jesus. All this person was doing was mopping the floor, but that was their act of service. And they knew who they were in the kingdom of God at that particular moment in time. They knew who they were. In other words, they were secure in their identity. And that's the last part of this. You can ask these questions all day long. How does the world know who you are? And how do you know the world? Who do you identify with? Do you want people to see God in you, or do you want them to see you? Do you want people to see what God has done and accomplished in your life, or do you want them to see what you have accomplished? You can ask those questions all day long, but when it comes right down to it, you are the one who has to answer those questions in your heart. You're the one who has to be secure in your identity. You have to be secure in what you know is true in your life. And in this particular case, David was secure enough to say, God, you are great. You're the one who has accomplished these things, not myself. That is the heart of humility. And when it comes to identity, we have to have humility in our lives. We have to have a sense of humbleness, knowing that God is the one who accomplishes things, not us. And if we have that sense of humility, then when people look at us, they will see God and not us. And God will be glorified. And that is one of the hardest things to do. The prayer that David put here said, God, you be established forever. God, you reign forever. That is one of the hardest things to do. At the start of this prayer, his question was, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? He's not asking the question as if he doesn't know. He's putting himself in perfect perspective in relationship to God. And in this case, he knew who he was, but he knew that he was lesser than what God had accomplished in his life. That is an attitude we all need to adopt. That should be our identity. Who am I? I want people to see God in me. Who am I? I want people to see what God has done, not what I have accomplished. Who am I? I want people to see the sovereign God. David prayed that prayer in utter humility. Can we pray that prayer? Let us bow our heads in order of prayer.